Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Holly M. Crawford, and I am the Director of Adult Public Programs at LACMA. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm honored to present this lecture series, Rethinking Conquest, which is presented in conjunction with two exhibitions now on view at LACMA. Mixpantli, Space-Time and the Indigenous Origins of Mexico, and Mixpantli, Contemporary Echoes. I have an installation view in my backdrop and highly recommend seeing these works in person. The exhibition is co-curated by Dr. Deanna Magaloni, Deputy Director, Program Director, and the Dr. Virginia Fields Curator of the Art of the Ancient Americas, as well as the Suzanne D. Booth and David G. Booth Conservation Center Director at LACMA, and Elise de Carteret, the Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow in the Art of the Ancient Americas Department at LACMA. I'd like to invite Elise de Carteret to the virtual stage to provide an overview of the exhibitions and introduce this evening's presenter.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Holly. I'm happy to speak a little bit more about LACMA's two companion Mixpantli exhibitions, both of which were conceived to rethink the traditional narrative of conquest, creating an opportunity on the 500th anniversary of the fall of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan to center instead the creative resistance of Indigenous artists. Their works, including illustrated histories, featherwork, stone sculptures, and cartographic paintings, tell a story not of defeat, but of perseverance, renewal, and an enduring commitment to an Indigenous future. The Relación de Michoacán, which we will hear about tonight, is one of the earliest surviving illustrated manuscripts from colonial Mexico. Commissioned by the Spanish Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza, the Relación was produced by a Franciscan friar together with Indigenous noble informants and anonymous native artists who created its 44 illustrations. To this day, the Relación remains the primary source for studying the formation of ethnic identity and politics in colonial Mexico. Today, Angélica J. Afanador-Pujol will share more about this fascinating manuscript. This program is part of a four-part lecture series providing an in-depth look at the Florentine Codex and other Indigenous histories of conquest. Presenters include the scholars Deanna Magaloni of LACMA, Angélica J. Afanador-Pujol of ASU, Federico Navarrete of UNAM, and Jeanette Peterson of UC Santa Barbara. I would now like to introduce Angélica J. Afanador-Pujol, our distinguished presenter and colleague. Dr. Afanador-Pujol is Associate Professor at Arizona State University, where she teaches the history of pre-Columbian and early colonial Latin American art. She is the recipient of several awards, including 2 fellowships from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation and the American Council of Learned Societies. She has published essays in leading art journals, and in 2015, the University of Texas Press published her book, The Relación de Michoacán, 1539 to 1541, and the Politics of Representation in Colonial Mexico. She is also the co-author of Don Antonio Huitzimengari, an Indigenous noble in 16th-century Mexico, published in 2019 by UNAM and the Universidad Michoacana de San Nicolás de Hidalgo. She has been a contributing editor for the Library of Congress's Handbook of Latin American Studies, and she is currently working on representations of food and conquest in pre-Columbian and early colonial Latin America. The Art Bulletin will be publishing one of her essays on this topic in June of this year. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Afanador-Pujol.
Thank you, Alice and Holly, for your kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be with everybody this evening and to be part of the lecture series of the Mixpantli exhibition. I'm really excited to be here with you and to share a little bit more about the Relación de Michoacán. So I'm going to share my screen right now. So, okay, so I was saying, I'm going to talk about a little bit about the Relación de Michoacán and how it relates to, for lack of a better word, to conquest and resistance in the 16th century Mexico. So the history of the Spanish invasion of Michoacán begins, like many tragic narratives, with ominous events. And for 4 years, according to the Relación, the temples tumbled even as they were rebuilt again. And 2 great comets illuminated the night sky, which at first priests and wise men thought that were signs that they would conquer others, but the gods had other plans for them. And in this image from the Relación, we can see here one of the night sky comets, and we see the temple here that it's, kind of falling apart. And many of the images of the Relación combine different events into one. Some of the priests then began to dream of strange men who were accompanied by even stranger animals that would come, their horses and chickens, which they found incredibly disgusting because they would travel everywhere with them. And they would dream that these would actually come and take over their temples. And then shortly after this, the gods began to appear to people to tell them that new men were on their way and that they would soon arrive to Michoacán. And here we see, also in this image, we see a woman who the gods come and talk to her to tell her about the Spaniards coming over. And I know for some of you who've been coming to the lectures, you've been learning about Mexico City or Central Mexico. And so the Spaniards were traveling west towards Michoacán here in the lighter color in the screen. Now these strange men, their horses and their chicken, had already wreaked havoc on the Aztecs east of Michoacán. And the Aztec ruler, Moctezuma, would have actually sent messengers 3 times to ask for help in fighting the invaders. But the long animosities that existed between the Aztec ruler and Michoacán's ruler, Suangua, whom we see also in this image, stopped the Michoacán ruler from helping his longtime enemy. And unfortunately, after one of the visits from these messengers, he became gravely ill and died. And his death would mark the beginning of one of the many pandemics that would desolate the population. And I have to say that our pandemic, even though has affected many people, was not quite of the magnitude. It did not impact us in the same, to the same extent that it impacted the people of Michoacán. So we can, now that we have lived through or are still living through the effects of a pandemic, we can imagine, what this must have meant for the people there. So among this pandemic, his young son would reluctantly have to rise to the throne and have to face the invasion of Spanish armies and thousands of their indigenous allies who were ready to also take over Michoacán. And here we see the young son in one of the paintings from the Michoacán. Tangashuan would be betrayed by one of his own generals who would go out to meet the Spaniards in their way to Michoacán, but instead of going to war with them and their indigenous allies, according to his own account, this general would actually welcome them peacefully. Now, the exact events of what transpired after that were subject to much debate in colonial documents. What we do know for sure is that 9 years after the arrival of Spaniards in the region, Tangashuan would be executed by Spaniards after having been accused of plotting against them, of having killed some of them, and as well as charging tribute or still collecting tribute which tribute is like our form of taxes from the people in the area, as well as idolatry and sodomy. The president of the Royal Audience, and the Royal Audience was the Spanish judicial body in colonial Mexico, Nuño de Guzman, who condemned Tangashuan to death, would also confiscate all of his goods and belongings and anything that he could have left to his family, and would leave him destitute. So when we stop and think about this for a minute, how could really the people of Michoacán recover from such tragic events, from this power takeover? How could they even deal with the new authorities? But I believe that the careful observations of documents such as the Relación can provide clues about the tactics used by the indigenous nobility to combat Spaniards in their own terms. Now, the manuscript's history begins about 9 years after Tangashuan's execution, that is around 1539, when the Spanish Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza, as Alice so kindly mentioned in her introduction, commissioned an anonymous friar to record the customs of the people of Michoacán. And we see this is the frontispiece of this is the manuscript here, and the manuscript is small. We have to think that this is a document that would have been given to the viceroy as the viceroy traveled through this area. And so this is the frontispiece that we have here on the right-hand side. And these frontispieces, like it's a presentation scene. This is rather common in European manuscripts as well. This is something that an artist would imagine what this presenting of the manuscript would look like, right? So it's painting before the fact, but here's an artist thinking about what would it be like to hand over the manuscript to the patron, right? And so we see the anonymous friar, who's a Franciscan friar here, handing over the manuscript to the viceroy, who sits in this sort of fancy chair and wears this long robe with the Order of Santiago insignia on it. And then next to him are his informants and painters, who then had contributed both in the narrative and then the 44 images. Now, many of these informants and painters were members or allies of Tangashuan's family, the Guanacaste family. And here is the term, since I imagine we will be learning about them through the rest of the presentation. Now, generally, the manuscript is, understood as kind of the history of the people we now know as Tarascans or Purépecha, but these are names that come later. That are Tarascans is given by Spaniards. Purépecha is the name; it's a word used to often used to denominate commoners. But it's actually the word that many indigenous people used in this area today. But the manuscript really kind of focuses on the history of this noble family. Now, the particular moment when the manuscript was commissioned is revealing of the kinds of interest that shaped it. The viceroy commissioned it when he visited Michoacán to settle a large land dispute over the Lake Passcode Basin. And even though the Lake Basin was under the jurisdiction of the Spanish crown and had been administered mostly by indigenous nobles, Spaniards in the area were quickly encroaching on its territories. And the land dispute that particularly triggered this visit was one against the encomendero Juan Infante. And an encomendero is a Spaniard that, due to his service, generally was given authority over particular group of people and a town generally, so that he could extract labor and services from this group of people. And Infante had been given a decree granting him the rights to extract labor and tribute from the town of Comanhan, and we see Comanhan right here. But by 1539, he claimed to possess a decree granting him jurisdiction over 25 towns, which included several on the shores of Lake Pátzcuaro. And in this map here, the red section is the section that he eventually claimed he had, this grant. Now, nobody actually ever saw this decree, only copies and hearsays, but it was the source of much litigation. So the Relación presented the indigenous contributors with a unique opportunity to shape the viceroy's views in the hopes of keeping the integrity of the Lake Basin and representing the Guanacaste as the rightful rulers of Michoacán. Now, to get a better picture of how this is accomplished in the manuscript, we will look at two different aspects. One being the insertion of landscapes in the manuscript, and the other, the treatment of the Guanacaste protagonist. And I will show you in this presentation that the artists and editors carefully selected scenes, indigenous motifs, and European spatial techniques that would highlight the indigenous ownership of the Lake Pátzcuaro Basin and the Guanacaste's qualifications to govern it. Now, the manuscript was originally envisioned as a three-part book with a prologue, but unfortunately, it does not survive in its entirety. Many of these manuscripts, as you probably have learned from some of the previous lectures, were destroyed, sometimes by inquisitory processes, sometimes just in transportation. So we have here for the Relación part 1 is mostly gone. We only have one page that survives. Several pages of part 3 are also missing. And so the only section that survives in its entirety is Plan 2. And close observation of this section reveals that most of the images were not originally planned, but were added by a group of 4 artists after 2 scribes finished transcribing the text. And here we could see in this image part of the process of how those images were added. So for instance, we can see this where the blue paint is chipping off. We could see some of the text underneath. So where there was text, they often whited it out. We see some of that white paint over here, and with a little bit of the text showing through. And then on top of that, they then put then they drew and then they painted over it. So, and while many scholars have seen these as simple corrections, I like to propose that in the manuscript, these images actually subtly amend the accompanying text and help us focus on those issues that were of particular importance to the painters. Now, part 2 of the Relación records the oral history of the area according to a Guanacaste high priest. And we see here also, this is an image from the Relación, the high priest telling the history to this imaginary audience. And this is one of the things I love about the Relación is, how it's aware, or its own awareness of the importance of the transmission of these stories, right? So it's not just about telling us the story, but about kind of staging the storytelling itself. And so the story, or the history, it's a migration story, very much like those of other indigenous groups in central Mexico, which recounts the entering of a migratory group into a desired homeland, and then stages the events that lead to the foundation of the community and the consolidation of that territory. Now, in the case of the Relación, the Guanacaste priest tells us that the Guanacaste first migrated into northern Michoacán, or northwestern Michoacán, where we see here Zacapu, and then they travel southeast along this red line, which is actually today is Highway 37, but then eventually came and settled into the Lake Passcode Basin, this, the gray area in the image here. And once they settled there, they eventually unified it under their rule, through series of political allegiances, marriages, and war. And even though the Guanacaste priest here speaks to this imaginary audience, we have to remember that the audience of the manuscript was really the Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza. So to understand the underlying purposes of telling the Viceroy such a story, we must understand that this is an epic story, and like many great epic stories, it kind of transports us to distant places and times. And in this process, it helps the reader understand these regions as experienced by this leading group. And we have to think that by the time the Relación was being compiled, about 20 years had passed since the Spaniards had arrived. Many towns had been decimated, others had been purposely destroyed by Spaniards and their indigenous allies. But as we read the manuscript, we get to experience with the protagonists the ancient territories and their incorporation into the Guanacaste state. The history of the Relación and the Guanacaste would have shaped the landscape of the Lake Passcode Basin as the Guanacaste's political domain in the mind of the Viceroy, who was new to this area. Still, this is a very complex story. It names over almost 300 places, over 90 characters. So it is hard to imagine how, somebody who would be new to this area, who didn't actually speak the language, would actually really been able to understand. I mean, the manuscript is written in Spanish, but the names and all these locations come in Purépecha, just that the language spoken in this region. So how would it really have helped him really conceptualize this space? So that's where the images come in for, they were painted after the text was completed and highlight a particular region of Michoacán's landscape, and that is the Lake Pátzcuaro Basin. So we're going to look here at some of those corrections the artist made, and I have photoshopped these 2 pages so we can get a sense of what the manuscript or the original layout was. And so the scribes originally only left room for these 2 images, one at the beginning of the account of part 2, where it was intended to contain a marital allegiance as stated here by the text. So how they gave the Guanacaste their daughters for wives. And then many things happened between that and the end. We have, another chapter here where another image would have gone, and that section would highlight the conquest beyond the Lake Pátzcuaro. And so once the manuscript was full, the section was fully written, the editor, whom presumably we believe is the Spanish friar, and the artist embarked on a careful editorial process. And instead, they highlighted the conquest of non-Guanacaste groups in the Lake Pátzcuaro region. So they were selective about which images to include, and they left the first 5 chapters without illustration. So we have no paintings that depict what one would expect to be key moments in a migration story. So for instance, the arrival to Michoacán is not there, or when the Guanacaste marry a woman from a local town who would then become the mother of their entire line. That's also absent and is generally depicted in other migration stories, but not here. Only when the Guanacaste reached the shores of Lake Pátzcuaro do the artist of the Relación introduce the first image. So that's the page, what it looks like without my Photoshop job. So rather than a marital allegiance, we have the arrival of the Guanacaste to the shores of the lake. So we see them here standing on the border here, and the majority of the space in this image is actually given to the lake. We see this fisherman whom they meet here. Now, the last image of this section, which was supposed to include a depiction of the conquest of the entire province, beyond the Lake Pátzcuaro area, the artist actually has decided to divide the image into 2. And over here, we see a conquest of a town. And on the right-hand side, the artist has again included the lake, and this is one of the islands where the Guanacaste supposedly kept their bounty from war. In the chapters in between these 2 images, the artist and editor painted over some of the chapter titles, and then the editor Henry wrote them and carefully placed them to create empty spaces between the titles and the ensuing text. So we see a little bit of that here, where you can see a little bit of that white out. So the original title for this image was here. And so the editor or the artist then whited out, rewrote it here on the top, and then created a space here for this image. And these scenes then will focus on the Guanacaste conquest of non-Guanacaste groups in and around the Lake Pátzcuaro area. So the first one, and this is an enlarged image of that, shows the opening battle between the Guanacaste, who's seen here on the right-hand side on the shores of the lake, and their islander enemies who look here a little bit terrified, while the Guanacaste kind of burned this large fire with the smoke would signal their arrival. They're taking over an arrow also to indicate war. Now, in many of these images, the shoreline of the lake stand as the only constant identifiable geographical feature. We see it again here, again with the lake, the islanders arriving, and here are the Guanacaste again ambushing one of their enemies. And it's noteworthy that although the lake basin is quite large and many communities lived and continue to live around it, its shores and on its islands, we often see no recognizable features that identify these communities. And here are a few more examples where the Lake Passcode stands as the only identifiable feature. Now, in addition to carefully selecting this landscape, the artists were also careful about how to present it and included many motifs that can be found in pre-Columbian and colonial manuscripts from other areas of Mexico. And there are no pre-Columbian or early, no pre-Columbian manuscripts from Michoacán that are known to survive. But we do know that indigenous paintings were widely used throughout the colonial period. They are recorded in many of the court's proceedings. And while Spaniards often acknowledged their significance, they were not necessarily able to read them. In judicial cases, indigenous witnesses would be called to interpret the contents of many of these pictorial documents. So in the Relaciones image, if the Relaciones images were to work on their own, that is to be understood by a European audience, clarity without sacrificing credibility was key. And we know that for the Viceroy, both the patron and audience of the manuscript, he in particularly asked that all documents, all pictorial documents be transcribed using alphabetic text. So sensitive to the Viceroy's reservations, the Relaciones artists selected pre-Columbian motifs that either could be understood on their own, such as the arrow here to indicate war, or footprints for movement. And this one here is an early colonial example from the Codex Selden in a different area, but we can see the parallel of what it is that the Relaciones artists are using. Or they pair some of these images with explanatory text, as is the case of the broken tree. And here, this is from a different manuscript, also from central Mexico. This is La Tira de la Peregrinación, or the Codex Puturini, where broken trees often signal the parting of ways between allies. Generally there's, some dispute or something, and so allies are going to split. And here in the Relación, we see also this depiction of the broken tree, but then the text of this chapter tells us that the Guanacaste had a big fight with one of their enemies, and then they went and climbed this tree, and the tree broke, and that's how they knew it was time to part ways. Now, generally speaking, pre-Columbian landscapes are composed of a vocabulary of two-dimensional natural formations, so just mountains, like we see here, or caves, as we see this one, or water bodies. And these are generally neatly delimited by contour lines or frame lines. And then they're filled with flat fields of color, such as the ones we see in the Codex Nutal here, which is a pre-Columbian manuscript from the Mixtec region. Now, these two-dimensional features are then combined to then provide kind of a whole geographical region and all this information. But in the Relación, these pre-Columbian iconographic elements don't often appear as isolated elements or as floating toponyms as they do in pre-Columbian predecessors and other colonial contemporaries. The artists incorporated them into the landscape using three-dimensional European techniques. So in this scene, for example, we see the logograph for the word Irecha, and Irecha is the Purépecha word meaning ruler, but it literally translates as the one who lives in a house. So, but when we generally see a man sitting in a house, we know that it represents the word Irecha. But in the Relación, it often appears as a kind of fully fledged living space. So for instance, here in this other image, we see where that space has become kind of a living room where people are gathering here to eat and drink, and then these ground lines kind of that vanish into a point in the distance give us the sense of death. also through the use of, gray wash in the floor and also darker gray wash in the background. It gives us a sense of depth. And also in the right-hand corner of this image, we see this cave. And caves for pre-Columbian manuscripts are often places of origin and transformation. And but here they have applied gray washes on the outside to kind of give a sense of volume, and then a darker gray here, and as well as this dark, this black color in the background to really kind of give this sense of depth. And so the viewer is given the opportunity to see, so to speak, beyond the icon, to imagine life within the circumscription of pre-Columbian spaces. So to understand the significance of the use of European visual techniques, it is important for us to think about their global impact. And the Renaissance saw a fluorescence of these pictorial techniques aimed at giving the illusion of reality on paper. According to the cultural geographer Dennis Cosgrove, this coincided with a desire on the part of Europeans to see the newly discovered lands, the people, and their relationship to the land. And, I was trying to think about, a parallel now, and I think, well, what about, the war in Ukraine, right? And I think many of us, we get up in the morning and we read our morning news and we want to see what is happening. We read, we look at the images, but now we have internet, we have phones with endless scroll possibilities. But this is the time before any of that. And so for rulers to even see the people that they were supposedly incorporated into their domains, or even just for general folks to see what the people on the other side of the world look like, what the war looked like, it was through manuscripts. This is how information traveled. So these new techniques allowed people to imagine these places. One of these techniques, the single point perspective, I imagine some of you may be familiar with that, was championed by art theorists such as Leon Battista Alberti, and became an important tool to create representations that seem real. And during the 16th century, this illusion of reality lent a sense of truth to painting. So for the artists of the Relación to visually represent places in ways that not only were legible to the viceroy, but that also seemed real to European eyes, they lent credibility to their story and the landscape. And this is a time when the representation of land had serious consequences, and all parties involved were aware of it. So take, for instance, the dispute with Juan Infante, the Spanish encomendero I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, who was trying to take over several towns. Now, in response to his attempt to take over, the indigenous nobility allied themselves with the Spanish bishop, Vasco de Quiroga, and they fought Infante on side in the courts, and most significantly through paintings. Unfortunately, none of these paintings survive, but we have an account of how one of these maps was produced for the court, and this account can illustrate the importance of painting the Lake Passcode Basin. So according to this account, in 1840, October 1840, so this is right as the Relación is being created, both parties had to present paintings of the lake area and had to agree on the contents of a final version. And so first, the indigenous nobility presented their own version of, the lake basin. And Juan Infante complained that this was poorly painted and it was just not true. And so Infante then presented his own version, which the Michoacán party then added and revised the information he had included. And so then Infante then took it back and added more information. And then at that point, then the people of Michoacán complained that that also was, not true. And so the royal audience, the judicial body, had to order many of these additions to be removed. And so these court processes were costly, they were laborious, they were time consuming. And so for the indigenous nobles, the Relación, gave this, exceptional opportunity to present their views about the landscape, about the Lake Passcode Basin, and about who should be the rightful owners of this, or rulers of this region to the viceroy, without the intervention of opposing parties, not just of Infante, but of also many other Spaniards that were encroaching on this region. And now the Relación stands as the only visual record produced during this land dispute. As to whom should govern this land under the colonial government, they did not leave it to chance either. Now, the text describes the Guanacaste in terms that come very close to Christian ideals and even the four cardinal virtues, Christian cardinal virtues of fortitude, justice, prudence, and temperance. They are said to be prudent in war, brave and strong, defend their God Curicaweri against all odds, bring justice to the region, are moderate in food, sex, and drink, and they offer the material wealth acquired through war to their God. The images make sure to create a dichotomy between the Guanacaste as virtuous and their morally lacking enemies. And for example, beneath titles intended to accompany depictions of marital allegiance between the Guanacaste and other ethnic groups, the artist instead created images intended to demonstrate the inappropriate conduct of Guanacaste enemies. So in this image, for instance, under the title of How Tariacuri Married a Daughter of the Lord of Curinguaro, an artist represented Tariacuri's marriage. And so Tariacuri is the Guanacaste lord here. And here comes this group who would be his future wife. And they come from a different ethnic group. And so we see two men here and three women, and then the food kind of hovers above them. And so this is the marital or the marriage party here. But then the artist also added this path with this woman walking away. And scholars have interpreted this, this woman as being the wife who has actually abandoned the husband. And the editor of manuscript seems to agree with this, because after the title had been added and the images had been put in, the editor then went ahead and wrote here in tiny letters, and she was a bad woman, or fue mala mujer. The following image also highlights the misconduct of this non-Guanacaste woman in the center of the scene, which we see here. I'm going to put a slightly larger detail here. We see her literally two-timing her husband with two men from her own ethnic group. And then by marked contrast, her husband, who is here, this is Tariacuri, he's in the forest and he's burning a fire, he's burning wood for his God Curicaweri. And then when he comes home over here, he finds her covered in the black ashes, the body paint of her lovers, and she's smelling of wine. And so according to the text, her actions incited a war between the Guanacaste and her people. And in the next image, we see how, they're after this war, her family, her group are actually being sacrificed here at the Guanacaste's God's temple, and this God is supposed to have intervened in the Guanacaste's favor and even help the Guanacaste succeed. Now, Tariacuri, the pious husband, on the other hand, goes on to become the mastermind behind the unification of most of Michoacán under Guanacaste rule. Now, in the only Grisel in the Relación, he is depicted giving a speech. And so we see him here to his nephews and his sons about why the Guanacaste should conquer their enemies. And the artists use gray washes and lines to represent volume and depth, which resemble the etchings of European printed sources. And these printed sources were, during the early colonial period, often served as models for paintings by indigenous artists. Now, this Grisel comes very close, actually, to a image of Christ and his disciples. And we see here This is Christ and his disciples on a book of hours of Charles V, which was also based on printed sources. And so Tariacuri then becomes kind of this equivalent of this Christ figure. And in the text that accompanies the image, Tariacuri states their reasons for conquering the region in terms of the deficiencies of his enemies. He says that some of the rulers were impious, others drank too much, others never settled their differences, they were always in dispute, and the noble women, very much like his former wife, had multiple sexual partners. And the gods are said to have even sent plagues to those who stopped worshiping and started drinking, as in biblical times. So the flaws of the Guanacasa's enemies closely parallel violations of the Christian code and become the justification for their conquest and the necessity of the Guanacasa rule over them. And this sort of moralizing imagery and narrative is often found in other European political treaties, medieval and Renaissance. Many of these came to Michoacán, books like Saint Augustine de Civitas Dei or the works of Thomas Aquinas. And many of them derive this code of conduct from biblical precepts and stress the need for the moral virtues of rulers. Now, in addition, the Guanacasa are said to have excelled in their prowess as hunters, and particularly the hunting of deer, and had introduced hunting with bows and arrows to the region. And here we see the Guanacasa ruler holding his bow and arrow, which is one of, it's actually part of his regalia of rulership. And in the process of describing them as these kind of superb hunters, the text also characterizes them as brave men, austere and abstinent when it comes to sex and drink. And such characterizations, again, come very close to the Christian morals of the time. Now, European aristocrats and clergymen and rulers also cultivating this hunting culture. Hunting scenes would often decorate the walls of manuscripts of these nobles' households, as we see on the screen right now. And among European models, hunting was thought to prepare knights for war, both physically and mentally, and to help them cultivate their moral virtues. These self-indulgent pastime was often justified in Christian terms because its vigor aided in avoiding temptations of the flesh and spirit. The pursuit of the hunt was compared to spiritual quest. Deer hunting in particular, the chosen Guanacasa prey, bore special symbolism among Christian audiences. The hart was often associated with longevity and consequently with the possibility of humankind's eternal life through the acceptance of Christ. And Christ was often associated with deer and its hunt with his passion. Tracking prey was like tracking God's presence on earth. And this was epitomized in the vision of San Eustaquio, a Roman nobleman of the 2nd century, whom we see in this painting by Pisanello, where he is represented having this vision of Christ among the antlers of a hart. And here we see Guanacasa hunters also with a deer. Now, the makers of the Relación must have been well aware of these hunting metaphors as potentially embodying the pursuit of Christian ideals, since Michoacán was evangelized early on. Hunting exercises, including target shooting and catching deer, were used in the conversion of neophytes. These exercises were analog to reaching Christ through personal effort and achieving spiritual perfection through practice. And according to Cristobal Cabrera, who was the apostolic notary of the bishop of Michoacán, children competed at short arrows, and here I quote him, so that just as they directed their arrows at a given target, so too were the deeds of their life to converge towards a definite goal, our Lord and Savior. So, and Cabrera goes on to characterize bows and arrows as means to an end, knowledge of the faith, a mightier weapon that could lead to spiritual salvation. So the use of hunting in the Relación is not just a mean of training warriors, but it's also a way of convey their Christian values and to the audience. Now, at the end of the section, the Relación, the manuscript makers also added a page to make sure the viewer was clear on the rightful ruling line. And for this, they depicted the Guanacaste genealogical tree. The tree shows us the long lineage of 19 Guanacaste lords, starting centuries earlier and ending with Sinsincha Tangashuan, who wears the white baptismal robe and a matching ribbon on his hair. And his robe, like that of his sons, marks his acceptance of European norms by referencing his baptismal status. The genealogical tree is based on the tree of Jesse, a Christian icon depicting Christ's genealogy from Jesse, the father of Queen David. And here we see Jesse, and out of his torso come this tree with prophets and sibyls, and then the Virgin Mary and Christ top it. Now, the Relacion's artists were not the first ones to use this. European artists have often adopted the tree of Jesse to exalt their own European dynasties. So in the Relación, the artist substitutes Christ's genealogy for that of the Guanacaste indigenous noble families to represent them as the rightful rulers of the area. And we know that this worked in the colonial system because Tangashuan's sons often employed similar strategies to this of the tree to ask for their return for their goods and privileges. For example, in a letter from 1542, Don Francisco, whom we see here, and let me show you a larger detail. So in this letter, he stated that he had already gained land and jewels because he had successfully argued his direct descent from the Guanacaste line, like he is shown in the tree. And later that year, he also claims that since he was a good Christian and he lived and dressed like a Spaniard, as he is shown in the tree with his white gown, his shoes, and he's even cut his hair, he was worthy of a royal grant. The strategy not only worked for him to regain some of this wealth that had been taken away from his family, but he became governor of the area 2 years after the Relación was completed. So in conclusion, after the scribes wrote the text, the editor and artist decided to include new images that reshape the narrative by focusing the viewer's attention on the Lake Passcode Basin. The story of action reclaimed places that had been abandoned, recalled previous conquests, and all rekindle a history of and through the land. The artists represented the Lake Passcode Basin as a politically organized, a unified region under the Guanacaste rule in a way that Europeans could recognize and understand it. In order to reinforce the Guanacaste authority, the artists established a dichotomy between the Guanacaste and their Christian-like values versus those of their misbehaving enemies. The parallels between the Guanacaste and the European aristocracy were also reinforced through the use of a genealogical tree based on the tree of Jesse. At a time when the Guanacaste had been ousted from the local government, the Relación gave its participants an exceptional opportunity to present them to the Viceroy as the rightful rulers of the Lake Passcode region. Thank you.